Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo.
Well, it's an odd word. People don't walk around the streets all the time talking about privatism. It does point to something that is very real. That is that we end up thinking of ourselves and our world in private terms, in more isolated terms. It creates a sort of feeling of estrangement and alienation, and we lose a sense of the public good, of the public virtues, and working somehow for a larger project.
Today on Reflections, Father Bacik talks with Father James Cryan, who is pastor of St. Pius X Catholic Church in Toledo. Father Bacik and Father Cryan will discuss privatism in our culture, insights from the Church. And now, here is Father Bacik.
Jim, sometimes theologians seem to make up words to get at what they mean. I think a lot of people, when they think of theologians, think of them as people who write in abstract and language that is often unintelligible and not ordinary language. And I guess we're sort of falling into that because I want to talk about the notion of privatism. It's a word that makes sense to me, and I get it from the German political theologian Johann Baptist Metz, who's still alive and teaching in Germany, and a great disciple of Karl Rahner, associated with the whole notion of political theology. But one of his major things in life is, and his great mission, I suppose, is to overcome privatism. And you can see that privatism at work in many different ways. You can see it in the culture in which we live, when people are just very anti-institutional. They say they're against government and against labor unions, and we got low ratings for corporations and churches and so on, and public opinion polls. So there's a privatism in the culture like that. There's even a privatism in our own spiritual life, where we end up thinking that, well, I'm going to get myself to heaven, save my soul. We can see a privatism in our relationships, where maybe we have a mode of domination and rather than mutuality, and it's really a matter of just cultivating my own self-interest in the way I relate to other people. And so I want to extend that a little bit and talk about a privatism that even comes into the church, and the way Metz analyzes that, and the way we might try to overcome that. So while it's an odd word, people don't walk around the streets all the time talking about privatism, it does point to something that is very real. That is that we end up thinking of ourselves and our world in private terms, in more isolated terms. It creates a sort of feeling of estrangement and alienation, and we lose a sense of the public good, of the public virtues, and working somehow for a larger project.
I think in our own lifetime we've seen a switch, though, in the United States on that. During the war years, as children, I remember people saying, "Are you an American or are you a Catholic?" It was strange for a kid, growing up in a Catholic school, but why do you have two flags? You have the papal flag and the United States flag. Which is the flag you make allegiance to? And the question would never have risen to me spontaneously. There was no difference. But in the United States, I think we had that issue of proving ourselves as Americans, and then it only increased even more emphatically the difference between the American church and the Church in America, between the American people, and the church became so separate. And we always said that the more truly Catholic you were, the better American you were. And the whole thing, before the studies on civil religion backfired on us, until finally the point where our schools began to decline in numbers, as Greeley's study, and the nation said, "We don't really care about your schools that much. If we'll assimilate you if you can't do it yourself." And I think at that point, the American bishops were reevaluating themselves on can the church itself become countercultural? Because if so, then the church can no longer be a private institution. At that point, and that was, I think, even before Vatican II, with the Second Vatican Council, the Universal Church said, we must be countercultural. We have a statement to make, not against society, but in a rather prophetic role, saying there are alternatives to what we're doing to our world.
You know what I was thinking of, Jim, as you were talking, was the election of John Kennedy. There was an article recently analyzing that. If you remember, he gave a talk to the Houston Ministerial Association, and a very strong statement about, the Pope will not be influencing public policy in the United States. That was one of the great fears. Remember, it was said a Catholic could not be elected president because they would have a dual allegiance to Rome and to the Constitution, and how you were going to do that. Now, John Kennedy solved that problem by a very strong strong dichotomy. That is, almost as though his faith would have nothing to do with the way he operated as president, and that would be his primary duty. And if there ever was a conflict, I think it was said that he would, of course, withdraw from office. And the presupposition was, the way it was set up in that talk, was that that would never happen, because there couldn't be that kind of real dichotomy between faith and the running the government. So the article that appeared recently, and I didn't read it carefully, but got the general sense of it, was that Kennedy did us a disservice in a way by making it so split that the church then would have nothing to do with the public realm. And that's the way Metz analyzes what has happened in the modern world, that in the time of the Enlightenment, it was figured we got to get away from the authority of the church. We have to rely on reason. If you just listen to the church, then you'll always be in a childish state. You won't take hold, and the church will keep us from making social progress. So what we got to do is get autonomy for the nation state, and then we have to work politically within that state and use our freedom to make a better situation. That's a lot of what we did in the United States, separation of church and state. But what that did effectively was move the church and religion to the private realm, the realm of feelings, of personal piety, of family life maybe, but having nothing to do with the political realm. So this article is suggesting that John Kennedy, while that was a great advance for Catholics, and we felt good about ourselves and could rejoice in his election, and we made it in the American life, didn't have to feel inferior anymore, that maybe there's a residue, a byproduct of too great a split between the church and the public realm. Now we might, look and see, where that's going to take us. But it's an example, I think, of the way the church itself gets privatized.
The church usually, in a certain sense, we have no state religion. Nominally, there is, wherever you have values and the celebration of values and the ritual enacting those values, whether you call it religion or what, it's another religion. Even in Europe, the nationalist movement in Germany in the 1800s was ironically anti-Catholic as well as anti-Semitic, and it was being replaced by a state religion of its own origin. And the Church in the United States today seems to be especially concerned about retrenching its own identity. I'm a little concerned about the retrenchment of, not of loyalties, there's no question about the loyalties, but of being concerned about our own structure that much, to the point where we might be missing that prophetic role of reaching out and becoming countercultural. I
was just at a meeting recently, a dialogue between theologians and bishops, and there was a whole lot of talk about ministry, and a lot of the talk about ministry was intramural. That it was talking about Eucharistic ministers and readers at Mass and people on parish councils and so on. And Bishop Huffman made a very strong intervention, and it was, I think, well taken by many people, saying, well, let's not forget the ministry to the world, and that we can't just turn in on ourselves, and that's what we have to build up and celebrate. We have a whole movement is centered in the city of Chicago by prominent lay people, and I can't think of what they call it, Cathedral of the Laity, I think. It might be the title of the movement, but what they're trying to do is to make sure that in the Catholic community we don't just bring people into church ministries all the time and make them like little priests running around, but that we celebrate their ministry in the world, that the real job is to help create a better world, to overcome the institutions of oppression, to create more just systems and so on, and that is a major part of what we're doing. I think that it relates to what you were just saying.
Although the documents, especially if you go through the Diocesan Synod documents right now, almost all of them inevitably come down to say the layman has the best opportunity for this. But the layman, layperson, of him herself, cannot do this. I mean, they don't go along on it's more privatism. If you say, Joe Brown, you're a nice guy, go to work today and bring Christ to the marketplace, that's only extending the privatism another way. There is something that is countercultural, certainly in the personal experience of a value. To be honest in the marketplace is already, that's an achievement, bringing virtue there. But I think for Metz, the whole the structures of society now require a different kind of church experience.
I think what Metz and the political theologians generally have seen is the great importance of institutions and structures. That's one of Metz's criticism of his teacher, the great German Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner. Metz feels that Rahner's theology was too private, too much centered on the individual, and one of the reasons is they didn't sense the great importance of institutional life, the way we are programmed by the culture in which we live, the way society can imprison people in poverty, for example, the way structures can keep us from exercising our freedom or enhancing our whole attempt to become more human. So we see that more these days. We got a name for it. We call it social sin, right? Social sin means that private sin has a ripple effect. It gets embedded in institutions. If people are greedy, they set up institutions which maximize profit and don't attend to the social consequences of what the company's doing. So that social sin is a reality, and Metz says that the previous generation of theologians that grew up before World War II didn't really understand that and don't see it enough. So Metz keeps calling us back to the fact we live in an institutional world. We are institutional creatures. You can say we're social creatures, and that makes us feel like, well, yeah, you might go to a concert, or you grow up in a family, or you go to liturgy where you pray together, but we're not only social creatures, we're institutional creatures. You can't live without them. You know, if you're going to go to school or learn something in the United States today, you go to schools, and you go to an organized educational effort, and you got to go to a college or university. You might not like it, and the bureaucratic struggles may be overwhelming, but it's in that structure that you got to figure out how to learn something and maybe get a degree someday.
I was just thinking in the Zeffirelli's film Francis of Assisi, who probably will always remain in the church as the most countercultural of all of our major figures. When he becomes a problem to the institutional church, they decide to bring his charismatic followers, give them organization and sanction. It's a cynical point of view, and the Pope kind of looks cynical at the end of the film. Let's institutionalize this movement, and we can control it that way. But the actual point is that the movement of the church goes quite the other direction, I think. If Francis could not have extended his own charism without corporate sanction, and people would say, this is something I can identify with, I will identify with this my own level. But there's a point here about Francis of Assisi I really like, and that is when he, in the traditional story, kisses the leper. He who had been used to the fine life and the fast lane, all of a sudden does the unthinkable, the irrational. He breaks the barrier of alienation by embracing the barrier that divides. He made atonement not by reaching through and, say, handing the beggar money, or the leper money, or anything like that, or clothing. He embraced the barrier that divided and became one with him. And I think, generally, if you read the doctrines of the church now, this is what they're calling everybody to do. I'm not sure how it's done structurally, but
that does become the challenge. You're right. I mean, there is a sense of solidarity in the modern church documents. There's a call to that in the Second Vatican Council, especially the Pastoral Constitution on the church in the modern world. They call upon us to read the signs of the times, to see what's going on in the culture, and call upon us to create better economic, social structures so that people are really liberated and can be humanized. So there's no doubt. You see it in the papal statements throughout the whole of the 20th century. You see it in our bishops' pastoral letters on the economy and peace. There's that same fundamental message that we must transform the world. You know, to go back to our friend Johann Baptist Metz, very influenced by the Marxist dialogue. He dealt a lot with the Ernst Bloch, the Marxist who wrote about the philosophy of hope, and Walter Benjamin, who talked about the importance of identifying with the oppressed in society. That's one of the ways Metz came at all of this. I mean, well, to complete my idea, the Marxists keep telling us that the economic structures are important, and if they're not in place properly, that people are going to be oppressed, and that you have to transform the economic structures if you're going to create a better world. Now, we think that the Marxists are, utopian in this, and they haven't taken account of original sin, and that's why their structures keep getting messed up. And that there's a far greater wisdom, I think, in our founding fathers who saw the need for checks and balances in our governmental political structures. So, but Metz learned from the Marxists, despite all of their weaknesses and the way they're messed up in their thinking, the importance of institutions. And that if we're going to create a better future, you've got to think about creating better structures. And that's the only way you're going to eventually liberate people. Now, I think Metz goes on and really turns his attention to the church in all of this. There's a lot of thought that the political theologians maybe are anti-church, and I've talked to some experts who know about this, and they assure me that Metz doesn't really think that way at all, that for Metz the church is extremely important, and if he's going to criticize it, it's only for the purpose of building it up. And Metz, while he's big on base communities, he likes the Latin American church and the base communities, the small group of Christians getting together to try to transform the world, he also sees the great value of the institutional church. Now, there's sort of, among liberal Catholics today, there's certain thing like, let's put down the institutional church. It just gets in my way and keeps me from being a real Christian and so on. But Metz doesn't see it that way. He sees a positive role for the institutional church.
Oh, again, any organization where there's dialogue going on within it, it provides a dialectic that helps everybody in the community. I mean, if everybody in the group all thinks alike and faces the same direction, never has any kind of challenge, it's hard to imagine how they would develop any kind of thinking. Even the institutional church provides enough conflict to say, son, do you know how you've hurt your father and myself? Even there in the structure of the family, there's tension, and that tension can be very creative.
I remember hearing Metz lecture in the United States in the 60s. He actually knew English quite well because during the Second World War, after his group of fellow soldiers, only 16 years old, taken from the school and were wiped out, Metz was eventually captured by the American Army, sent to a prisoner of war camp in France, and eventually came to the United States. And because he had some English already, he became sort of a camp interpreter, I think, and got to know American English better in that way. So I heard him lecture in the 60s, and one of his major messages to us at that time was, if you want to make the world better or do something, don't leave the church. That was a time of a lot of people saying, well, let's leave the church. I think maybe Charles Davis had just left the church and so on, and a lot of people were thinking, doing. Metz says, don't leave the church. He says, the only way that you can have an impact is by being a creative force within the institutions. Once you put yourself outside the institutions, you've lost all your power. You can't make any difference anymore. He said, be in there, and as you keep using the word, be a countercultural force in that sense. Be a force that calls the institution to become better. So he said, that was a ringing call back in the 60s. Don't leave the church. That's the way you make progress. Stay in and think of yourself as part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Yeah. Far more challenging. Hans Kung the same way. They said, why didn't you leave? He said, why should I? I'm part of them. It's my life.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is the way. And I think what it raises, Jim, is let's start thinking about this question of the value of the institutional church. Go ahead. You had another point to make.
This is the residue effect. It's not the trickle-down philosophy, but the residue. I know things that were done in religious communities 20 years ago that are being done in parishes now. Teamwork. That the pastor is not the privatized monarch who has all the answers, who can solve all the needs that are brought to his desk. Rather, he works in concert with others for consensus decision-making. These are things that many of the religious orders are doing beginning to do 20 years ago with much hesitation and much confusion at times. But nevertheless, it is the direction we're going, this communalization of the church as part of the trickle-down effect. Someone's charism somehow. Someone took the bold initiative at one time and said, Mother Superior, I think I got something I want to talk to you about. And she was open to listen to it. And they said, yeah, this is not a bad way of going. Let's work towards this. Let's share the spirit. And it could have begun in a charismatic community. It could have begun anyway. But that sort of thing does move through the church. And they're not hopelessly enmeshed, in documents somewhere. That gradually this process, collegiality, a major thing here too.
So you're saying that, this really will happen. You're saying concretely, you can look at cases where people stayed in. Maybe this nun felt like leaving because it was so oppressive, but she stays in, gets the Mother Superior to do something, gets a process going. We learn that in the church, and that eventually filters into the rest of the community.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
So that you can actually see how change can work within the church itself.
Certainly. Even things like, for a while there, the experimentation with paraliturgies, some of which were a little bit off the wall, frankly were, But at the same time, the idea of the nature of a paralyturgic did not need a priest celebrant. You could try a few experimental things in your communities. What happened was, now we have a generation of young Catholics being raised who have things like fantastic little rituals at the family meal. People are not afraid to hold hands at supper time to pray together, which is something which was foreign when I was a kid. They're not afraid to have a little cup of wine on the table, say a prayer for each other, and all drink from the same cup. These are things that do shape the consciousness of a people, and they come about through institutional sharing. It's passed along. It becomes a vehicle of the handing on of the tradition, or the traditions in this case. Yeah.
One of the things Metz wants to insist is that the institution of church has value, and I think it's important to spell that out. One of the values is it's where the memory of Jesus is kept alive. I mean, how would we know about Jesus and his liberating power unless the story kept being told in the church? We wouldn't have a scriptures unless the church told the stories of Jesus and eventually got them written down. So one of the reasons we have a church is to keep the memory of Jesus alive. I think that needs to be said to Christians who are so privatized in their notion of the church that they say, well, I want the scriptures and I want Jesus, but I don't want the church. Well, they come together because you don't have Jesus, you don't have the memory of Jesus without the community that kept it alive throughout all these centuries. Not only kept it alive, but keeps reinterpreting it and making it available as a powerful force for changing society today.
Representing it. As children, the sacrifice of the Mass was represented, but you'd say represented. Each day this is renewed for our challenge, for our interruption, for our reflection, for our experiencing, and there's always something new about it. Mark Tannenbaum had a marvelous dialogue with Philip Sharper once. He took from the two aspects, from representing the Passover in the Jewish family, and also about the value of the institution itself in getting things done in society today. He said with Bangladesh, how would you have anybody have handled that except through Jewish relief services, Catholic relief services? These things do not get done except at those levels, even in a pragmatic point of view.
Yeah, that's right. You raise a really important point. That is the power of the institutional church to be a lever for good, precisely because it's massive, has large numbers, a focal point of leadership, because it can exercise political clout. Mm-hmm. That's the way it works. In other words, Metz says the world's made up of powerful institutions. Mm-hmm. So we've got government, and we've got the corporate structure, we have the unions, we have the educational structures, and so on. And the church needs to be in there as an institutional presence. That 10 Christians together can't make a difference. But if our bishops decide to write a pastoral on peace and get a whole process where people are discussing it, they begin to make a difference. That's a voice that Washington has to listen to. Then it can't coerce Washington. It can't be a final word, but it becomes an important dialogue partner in trying to create a better public policy. And so the bishops, I think some of our people are seeing that these days. The bishops are a force for good as few people could be. I mean, who else could write an economics pastoral and get people to discuss it in that detail around the country and get the governmental figures interested in it at all? That's amazing, and you only do it because there's a lot of people well organized. An institution that has got its own problems, its own sinfulness, and yet keeps alive the liberating memory of Jesus and brings it into the mix of the public debate. Mm-hmm. So that's a side of it, I think, that we need to play up and to keep in mind the value of institutions. And of course, that's what the political theologians see, and I think Metz is a perfect example. You can link Metz with a lot of others. I mean, he has affinities to the liberation theologians in Latin America, because they both see you got to look at the world in a sense from the side of the oppressed and the poor and those on the margins. You have to refocus the gospel so that you see the Christ not only as personal Savior, but as the liberator of captives, the one who preaches the good news to the poor, so that Luke 4 becomes very important. These people are very taken by Matthew 25, that Jesus really tries to say, I identify with the poor, the homeless, the hungry, the thirsty so much that if you did it for them, you did it for me. Metz thinks that, the way we interpret the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, Metz thinks that's a great thing here. Matthew spiritualizes them. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Luke has it more concrete, down to earth, blessed are the poor. And Metz says, no, you got to keep Luke in mind too, so that we can identify with those people.
I feel more firmer ground with Metz. I've read Sobrino and Buff, but maybe because he's Buff is they're both European. I think he has more to say to Americans. He gives good principles, I think, that we can interpret for ourselves.
Metz does.
Metz does, yeah.
My part of my sense is that Metz has got a striking message for middle-class Americans.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, and that message becomes
a friendly message. He's not talking down to us or saying, hey, you guys haven't done what we've been doing down here in Latin America. You get your act together. He's saying, no, I'm with you, but here's the direction we are going. And in that sense, he offers a lot of hope to the church.
Yeah. That's good. You want to expand that at all? That's a really important point.
I think the ordinary person says, I'm a member of the Catholic Church. I am loyal. I know there's something happening in the world that's afoot. The Church says, get with it. I'm not going to run down to Guatemala and get my eyes poked out. Tell me what I should be doing. And Metz will say, we are part of a longer tradition. We have this history with us. The Gospel speaks to us about solidarity. This is our Catholic experience. We've never been privatized. We are always the people of God, the Church. And what the Church is saying today is we're being truest to our truest tradition. This is our basic tradition of this kind of solidarity.
That's well put, Jim. I love your pastoral sense about all of that. And that's always the question. How do the theologians help us to see how the Scriptures speak to us in terms of our everyday life? And what Metz helps us to see is there's a privatizing tendency in the culture, in relationships, and in the Church itself. It's been there, but we can overcome it. And we overcome it in a positive way by saying, no, the Church can be a force for good in the world. Collectively, we can do more than we can do privately. And the social gospel brought to bear on modern problems, we should be people of hope that we can make a difference.
You've been listening to Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at the University of Toledo. Today, Father Bacik talked with Father James Cryan, who is pastor of St. Pius X Catholic Church in Toledo. The topic of this week's Reflections was Privatism in Our Culture, Insights from the Church. If you have any comments on today's show or suggestions for future programs, please write Father James Bacik, Catholic Campus Ministry, 2086 Brookdale Drive, Toledo, Ohio, 43606. Funding for this program was provided by the Catholic Communications Commission of the Diocese of Toledo.